Today, we're joined by Linda Tuck-Chapman, CEO at Third Party Risk Institute and an expert on global risk assessment. Linda, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Perfect. So how has COVID-19 and the move to the work from home model heightened exposure to digital risk in the industry?
Oh gosh, I think in early days in COVID, there was such a huge amount of concern about moving to a home-based environment. I would say that most companies have done a really terrific job of transferring all of the protocols that they would normally have in a work in the office environment to a work from home environment. And that includes third parties, vendors, et cetera, around the world. This is not new. It just was quite a scramble in the beginning. Where I think the challenge is really coming in these days is, in fact, this hybrid model that is emerging. So you have people working from home and you have people going back to the office a couple of days a week. So that's putting a huge burden on the cybersecurity and technology and information security people to try and maintain two environments. It's costly, it's confusing. And I was talking with my brother-in-law the other day. His people work on desktops, so he's not sure how he can accommodate a work from home environment. There's only one thing that we haven't solved for, I think, when it comes down to endpoint security and cybersecurity in a work from home environment, and that is basically the physical privacy. There's nothing to say that people are actually following a clean desk policy and that their screens are not being observed by other people. And that remains the largest concern. But for the rest of the people, I think people have done a great job.
Okay, great. And so, Linda, how can companies take steps to reduce risk associated with their vendors and clients?
What's really happening today is that the concept of third-party risk management has expanded not just globally, but also through industry sectors. So industry sectors that had never really contemplated the need for a robust third-party risk management program are now scrambling trying to catch up to others. So the good news is that we've been doing this for more than 10 years, and the financial services sector and healthcare around the world have definitely led the way. There's tremendous resources available, so even if you're not in the sector, look at some of the guidance that's been written. So the primary regulators in the financial services sector in the, basically the G20 countries have done an unbelievable job over the decades of putting this in place. So A, you don't have to invent the wheel, and B, there's also great resources out there. Now, what I think is really what people need to appreciate is that you must know who you're doing business with and which companies you're doing business with in order to deliver goods and services to your clients, and also to provide core services to your employees, right? So all that backbone and email, et cetera. Where companies are probably still struggling is it's quite difficult to wrap your arms around the quote-unquote inventory of third parties. And when I say third parties, I'm not just talking about your vendors. I'm talking about everything that it takes to deliver goods and services to your clients or for services. That may be agents or resellers or maybe software that you're buying. So it's not just your vendor population. Now, the other thing that you touched on is the direct relationships that you have in your extended enterprise. And your extended enterprise is what you're running today. It's not your company and everybody else. It is a complex extended enterprise. So where it's more difficult is if you're doing business directly, you can do your homework, you can have a good inventory, you can have actually pretty good insight into the control environment. But when you're dealing with fourth parties and nth parties, it's much more difficult. You do not have contracts with a fourth party. Your third party does. And that means that rather than trying to do some due diligence on the fourth party, which is impossible, you have to actually understand how your third party is doing the work that you would expect. Do they know who they're doing business with? Which ones are critical to delivery of goods and services to your third parties who are supporting you? And are you comfortable with it? Right? That's where the gaps are. And when it gets down to nth party, I guess the next thing is if your fourth parties are doing a good job, it may well be that the fifth parties are. And once you get past there, you're starting to strain the brain a bit too much. So I've heard people say that, fourth party is old hat. It certainly is not. It's not. It's very hard to wrap your arms around. And it's more difficult than understanding your third party environment. And quite truthfully, during COVID, that's where some of the interesting issues have come from. Right? You may be dealing with very robust third parties, but they may have outsourced something to a fourth party or are reliant on them, and you may not be aware that they're even in place and whether they have good controls or even financially stable. Lots to think about here.
Absolutely. Okay, and then another theme at the moment that we're hearing a lot of is the idea of concentration risk. So what exactly is concentration risk, and why is the phrase a current industry concern?
Well, it's one of those risk terms, right? You have to come up with a word for what it means. It's putting all your eggs in one basket, right? It's a very simple concept. So all your eggs in one basket, though, has many different forms. You could have a high concentration with a single third party who's delivering a lot of goods and services to your organization, and you have a huge reliance on them. There could be an activity, or the first one's called entity level concentration. The second one is called activity level. So your activity level concentration risk may be a particular set of activities that it takes to deliver goods and services, a particular good or service to your client. Right, so you may have high concentration there, where you're dealing with a very seriously outsourced situation with a lot of third parties, or in fact the activity itself is very complex and has a lot of reliance on third parties. So that's the second one. The third one is geographic concentration risk, and quite truthfully, if you're new to concentration risk, start there. It's easier to understand where goods and services are being delivered from. But don't stop there. Understand the fourth parties and where they fit into the mix. And also, you also want to consider in the geographic mix is how comfortable are you with that particular location? Is it subject to weather events? Is it subject to earthquakes, etc.? Or, is there a shaky power grid? Those are the things you need to consider when you're looking at geographic concentration risk. And you actually can put some controls over this and move your business around so that you can reduce the concentration risk. Now, there's fourth-party concentration risk, which quite truthfully is just a subset of the other types, because when you factor it in. And last but not least, I think that people are beginning to wake up to the fact that there's cloud concentration risk. And that's very, very complicated, because you are dealing with cloud providers, your third and fourth and so on parties are also dealing with cloud providers. And then you need to also consider that the cloud providers themselves, you don't have any real insight into exactly where your data is, for example, because of the way that clouds are generally structured. So cloud concentration risk, I think, is one that should be moving to the top line. Now, the other thing I'd like to say about concentration risk is it's not all bad, right? Sometimes it makes a lot of sense to have a high concentration with a third party because they're really good at what they do and they can manage a lot of activities and complexity for you. So if that's the case, then what you really want to do is know that it's there and make sound decisions about whether or not that's a separate third organization, and not just decide that you need to, dilute the concentration. Right? The only one that I'm seeing controls around are geographic, because that makes sense. Everything else, it depends.
Okay. And then lastly, Linda, what are your suggested best practices for vendor evaluation?
Well, what's happening right now is that third parties are being inundated with requests for due diligence. So the way that things are done basically are you would go into an organization and you would send them a due diligence questionnaire, for example. I think that the days of that happening on a recurring basis are somewhat numbered. We're seeing new companies with good capabilities and AI come to the table with evaluations already completed. Now, if you're a small firm, it makes it pretty tough for you to do your own due diligence and then absorb all this information and disseminate it internally. So you may want to rely on a standards of control report, a SOC report, or an SSAE report, something where a third party has gone in and looked at the control environment. And I would suggest, just if you're going to do that, just bear in mind two things. One is, I guess three things. How old was it, right? When was it done? Secondarily, does it cover specifically the activities that the third party is delivering to, is using to deliver services to you in the same location? And last but not least is those SOC reports are dependent on your organization having controls in place. So you need to have these three things under consideration to make sure that they all hang together properly, or that SOC report's not going to be very useful. And like anything else, they're not all created equal. So using a SOC or relying on a SOC report by one of the big four, accounting firms is a good practice. The other ones, just make sure that they're well done, and if they're not, then don't rely on them. So, and then the other thing is that there is a lot of refresh going on. So companies that send out a due diligence questionnaire typically send them out on a recurring basis. So for the more important relationships, maybe each year or even less than that, and for the less important, they would do them sort of mid-contract. But I would suggest that that's probably not a winning strategy. There's lots of good ways to keep an eye on controls. And companies don't walk back their controls typically, right? So if they have financial problems, maybe they're going to cut corners, so keep an eye on that. But otherwise, what you really want to look at is, where are the changes that occurring that could hurt you, right? Have they outsourced to a fourth party? Have they moved to service delivery location? What are the key controls, right? About that long list of controls, sometimes hundreds or even thousands, which are the most important. So go back and check those, and don't send out these due diligence questionnaires that are looking at everything all over again, over and over again. Because what you're doing is putting a lot of work in your organization, and you're putting a ton on your third party, and the return is a diminishing return, right? So these are just things to keep in mind. So gosh, Peter, there is so much to talk about here. I could go on all day, but I won't.